Hey friends, this is Mr. Ward, and we're going to be looking at our new study guide, so let's go ahead. First of all, I have a little reminder about our social studies movies we're going to be making all about the Revolutionary War, and hopefully we'll get to do those in a couple of weeks. Also, we're going to be going to Frankfurt here in a couple of weeks or so I'm looking forward to that, and just tell your parents to be on the lookout for some permission forms. This looks a little different because I'm on my phone, so yours should look just about the same when you go on Google Classroom, but mine will be a little more close up. Now, keep in mind this is in classwork, like it usually is. All right, first of all, we have the word parliament. You should remember this from last week. It's just a group of representatives who vote on laws and taxes, and they're really similar to our Congress here in the United States, like our senators and our state representatives. The colonists who lived in America, they wanted delegates, which is just a fancy word for representatives, and parliament, but they wouldn't allow it. Colonists had no say in taxation. But remember, Parliament was the group who were in England who got to vote on all that stuff. Monopoly. Now, this isn't the game, but the reason the game is called this is because of this word. It's when one company or country is the only one who's allowed to sell a certain good. That means that they can charge whatever they want to for it. It's kind of like what England had with their tea. And we'll talk more about that in the notes. But just remember, let's say, for instance, if you were the only person who could sell a black t-shirt, then you could probably charge whatever you wanted for a black t-shirt because there's always going to be people who need a black t-shirt or who want one. So that's what a monopoly is. Liberty. Liberty is just a word that means freedom. In the case of the colonists, it's the freedom to govern themselves. Sounds complicated, but it's not. It just means that they want the freedom to be able to make their own decisions. Rebel or protest, that's to refuse to obey those who are in charge because you have a different idea about what's right and wrong. This can be violent or non-violent. You know, when we talked about how some of these Sons of Liberty would beat up tax collectors or tar and feather them, that would be violent. But then the non-violent protests would be things like boycotts because no one really got hurt. Boston Tea Party. So this is one of the most famous events in American history. And in 1773, disguised colonists dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor in order to protest the Tea Act tax that England had created. Treason. This is the betrayal of your own country by giving help to one of its enemies. One famous traitor in American history that we'll learn more about in a few weeks is Benedict Arnold. That's just when you turn your back on your country. Smuggling. So if you smuggle something, you sneak something into a place where it's not allowed. It's kind of like if a kid smuggled in a cell phone to school or something like that. For example, back then, people smuggled in tea and other goods from other countries into the colonies, even though they were only allowed to buy it from companies that were approved by England. Massacre. It's when many unarmed citizens are killed, usually by soldiers, kind of like the Boston Massacre that we looked at the painting for, drawing of yesterday. Intolerable or coercive acts. In 1774, British laws that said that colonists had to pay for the tea that was lost in the Boston Tea Party, and they blockaded Boston Harbor. When you blockade something, that just means you block it with ships. Soldiers were allowed to live in the colonist homes. Sons of Liberty. This is a group of colonists who organized protest against the British government. They were very radical and extreme, and sometimes even used violent protest. Tyranny. This is when you're ruled by a government that doesn't give you a representative, so you have to pay taxes and you have to do what they say, but you really don't have any control of what happens. Tea Act. This is a British law that said colonists were only allowed to buy tea from England, only at a high price. This law caused the Boston Tea Party to happen. Quartering Act. This is a British law that said British soldiers were allowed to live in the colonist home and even eat their food. First Continental Congress. This is a meeting between delegates, which is a fancy word for representatives, from all 13 colonies, and they decided they need to boycott British goods. And they need to form militias. That's armies made up of normal people that they train to fight. And they asked England to repeal the acts, but England said no. So we'll look at a few of our notes here. Some notes about the Boston Massacre. Soldiers were sent out to control the colonists. Crispus Attucks, who was a black sailor, yelled something out, and this caused confusion, and then it caused the soldiers to shoot 5 unarmed colonists, including him. John Adams, who was the future second president, made the decision to represent the accused soldiers in court because he believed everyone deserved a fair trial. It turned many colonists against rule by Great Britain. So in other words, this was the event that caused a lot of colonists to say, okay, I think we need English soldiers to leave. 1773, this is the Boston Tea Party. This was Sam Adams' idea. At night, the colonists disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, and they snuck aboard a British ship and they dumped tea to protest the Tea Act. The king punished all the colonists by making them pay more taxes and blockading Boston Harbor. So there's a sequence of events that you need to remember for the test. That's why it's highlighted in yellow. First of all, the 3 East India Company ships anchor in Boston Harbor. Now, these are the ships that actually held the tea. Next, members of the Sons of Liberty boarded the ships and dumped the tea into the harbor. Third, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts. Remember, those were to make the colonists pay for the tea. And finally, the colonists decided to participate in the First Continental Congress to boycott it. So just remember that sequence of events. The ships, they go into the harbor, they board the ships and dump the tea, they pass the Coercive Acts to make them pay for it, and finally they participate in the First Continental Congress so that they can boycott them. Now remember, the Intolerable Acts, also called the Coercive Acts, King George blockaded the harbor until the tea would be paid for by taxing the colonists. No imports or exports were allowed to or from the colonies. Soldiers could live in the colonists' homes. A guy named James Otis said that taxation without representation is tyranny, and we talked about this a little bit last week. It just means that paying taxes without having a representative is abuse, or you're being mistreated from the government. So a lot of these things you'll see on the test this Friday. Remember, it is important to know that sequence of events that's in yellow right there. And of course, to know all of your vocabulary words. So hopefully this helped you guys out, and I hope you have a good rest of your NTI day. All right, take care.